Okay, so that's part one, and I'd like to shift a little bit into some of the management work now. Compared to what's going on here, management seems a little bit silly in Colorado, and just in terms of the amount, the intensity, and sort of the approach to it all. And the management for the bark beetle in the West is sort of focused on three different things, and primarily it's based on safety. Now, as the bark beetle outbreak came in the late 90s and early 2000s, activities were going on in sort of a same as they always had been. So the idea was, we're going to go in and try to salvage, we're going to try to do some mitigation of the beetle outbreak, but within a few years that kind of went away. I think I mentioned that yesterday. Some of the first planning activities stated objectives were to try to reduce the beetle outbreak, but fairly quickly, because of the slow pace in getting work done, people gave up on that and became more concerned with things like people getting crushed by trees, trails being closed, power lines going down. And so the main focus right now are on things like roadside hazard sales, and any kind of treatments have to be tied with high density populations in WUI areas, wildland urban interface, or municipal watersheds. There's a very small amount of what you folks are talking about now in terms of replanting. So there's some of this recovery work would include planting, but largely it's regenerating stands silviculturally to try to recover stand structure and healthy forests rather than planting. There haven't been a lot of problems with regeneration in these stands, so planting isn't a real big issue. And then the resiliency, sort of the longer term approach, looking at ways to sort of create a mosaic of age classes, as people say, throughout the landscape. So putting in cuts to break up areas of old growth and try to regenerate new stands. So this is another one of these big increase in a small number kind of graphs. I put this together a few years ago to look at the amount of areas that are being treated in the epicenter of the bark beetle outbreak. This is the Sulphur Ranger District on the Arapahoe-Roosevelt National Forest west of Denver. And a couple of things I wanted to point out was this is the bark beetle outbreak at the end, showing the increase in harvesting. But you can see sort of the decline in harvesting that went on during the 60s and 70s in Colorado, when mills were being shut down and the timber industry was basically packing up and leaving. So there was and during those years back in the 60s and 70s, harvesting that was going on was sort of split between clear cut and sort of selective cutting. So they were harvesting a lot of spruce then. Since the beetle outbreak came in, it's been all lodgepole and all clear cutting. So there's been a big increase in activity, so we're seeing some things going on, but still, if you look at of the amount of area in this part of Colorado that's been affected by bark beetle, they'll be lucky to hit 10 to 15% of the acres that have been affected by bark beetle. We have a lot of wilderness, we have a lot of roadless areas, we have a lot of areas that are off limits for harvesting. So kind of a big change, but it's still a fairly small number. I threw this slide in sort of after hearing Bonnie's talk yesterday. In Colorado, there's been this large change in sort of the atmosphere and attitude towards logging that's sort of demonstrated by this sort of big bar here. People went from hating logging to demanding logging kind of overnight, and unfortunately, as you know, a lot of you know it, 2 decades of atrophying of the timber industry, it was hard to bring it back. We didn't have timber sale administrators, didn't have the kind of capacity on the ground to do work, but the idea was, the other quote I couldn't find in my old slides was, it's not when we're going to have the catastrophic fire, it's not if we're going to have it, but when. And that was another one of these Denver Post headline papers, articles. A lot of the concern in Colorado was based on concerns about catastrophic fire. and there's been lots and lots of argument about it, and lots of science and kind of people going back and forth on whether it's a big issue, how long will it be an issue for, is this something that we should be treating for, and there's been a sort of a swing back and forth. I think at this point people, especially now that the red needle phase is gone in Colorado, and people are sort of thinking a little more clearly. It doesn't look like a forest full of dry Christmas trees anymore. There's a little bit less of that pressure to be cutting for fuels issues. But it's noteworthy to see that we've actually had quite a few fires in this very densely populated part of Colorado in these bark beetle forests. So in the last couple of years, there's been over a dozen fires. And we've had a graduate student at Colorado State who's been going out looking at what are these fires, how are these fires burning? Are these mellow fires, are they burning more with more extreme conditions? And based on looking at firefighters' expectations and then their observations, almost across the board they're seeing that these are burning in sort of higher than expected conditions. And these are the fires that Kevin monitored in these last couple of years were kind of in the red to gray phase. So they're not all fully red, so you have to kind of take that into account. But there's definitely sort of an increase in burn behavior. And if you're operating as I guess with a precautionary principle as a federal land manager, management for reducing fire risk, you can't throw that out. And there's probably a lot of scientists that would say there's a very small window of high risk, but when you've got fires in bark beetle forests burning near houses in some of these areas, the sort of do nothing approach is kind of hard to justify. And I think that's certainly the approach that the U.S. Forest Service has been taking. So a lot of the management has been focused on that sort of thing. Okay, so talk a little bit about some of the findings from our managed systems. And I showed a slide yesterday showing kind of what our managed sites look like. The Forest Service focuses on areas with extremely high beetle outbreak. So obviously they're not harvesting in mixed species stands. They're harvesting in areas that have lost 80 to 90% of the overstory basal area to pine, trying to stay out of things like spruce. And we have several different bark beetle management areas that we've been working with on federal and state lands. One of the first questions that we addressed with our work was whether or not we would be looking at regeneration. We'd seen papers from Canada and concerns from our management community about whether the cones had viable seeds, whether we were going to be able to restock stands or not. And we did simple post-harvest surveys looking at the density of trees in clear cuts following beetle salvage, and compared those with adjacent areas in these same areas to see what the density of trees coming back in. And we found that there was certainly not a suppression of seedling density. In fact, it's not statistical, but it was certainly no lower than. And very few of these would have had any concern of replanting. So in other words, the clear cuts are coming back, and lodgepole remains a weed and will grow well following clear cutting. Forestry 101, but good to kind of be able to confirm that. If we look at plot level work across the Fraser Experimental Forest and other locations, comparing harvested and uncut adjacent stands, again, we see a big increase in pine. We see an increase in our other early successional species, aspen, in these stands. So fivefold increases in seedling densities. The red line again is the stalking rates. So we're way above our stalking limitations. So everything's looking pretty good. The other point to notice is that fir seems to be dominating in our uncut stands. If we take those trees that we found in our plots and then project them forward using forest growth and yield models, we see that our stands kind of return to the basal area they were at the time of the bark beetle outbreak in about 100 years. No surprise, they were about 100 years when they got hit, 100 years from now, we're restocking them, and they're going to be back up there. These are lodgepole dominated stands, even age. And the interesting thing, this is basal area, this is trees, this is density, trees per hectare. The interesting thing in these in this graph is that lodgepole, stands that are clear cut will remain lodgepole. But areas that we've uncut, we expect to see sort of an increase in the importance of subalpine fir over time. So here's the subalpine fir coming up in our uncut stands and being a larger player in the stands. It's equal to or above the lodgepole in these stands, and that's got significant issues for fire, habitat, and timber value for sure. We see a pulse of aspen in both our cut and uncut lodgepole stands, but that sort of fades within a few decades. Some of our current work is looking at sort of digging in a little bit deeper to look at how there are various phases of lodgepole, or the stands that are hit. We're looking at sort of pure stands of lodgepole, comparing that with areas that have a more sizable density of aspen and more of these spruce fir stands, and seeing how management might need to be tailored to address these areas. And we've done some experiments, some modeling experiments, looking at thinning from below and broadcast burning, and how that will affect recovery of stand structure, how that will affect the fire risks. So in our untreated stands, the areas that are heavy to fir will regain their basal area much more rapidly than the areas that are in pure pine or that have an aspen component. We can see that the burning has a residual effect, a long-term effect on the stand basal area in all of these forest types, and that the effect of thinning has a sizable effect within our pine stands. So we're taking out the understory fir, trying to keep that out, and keeps the basal area down longer, but has no effect in our aspen stands. In terms of the fire type questions, we've got our canopy bulk density, and I've plotted or Kristen Pells has plotted the threshold above which people start to get concerned about canopy bulk density. The light figures here, the light bars, are the untreated stands, and you can see that in our untreated stands, in the pine and in the fir pine mix, we start to get to canopy bulk density levels that are conducive to the spread of crown fires within about 20 years. So managers are starting to worry about fire risk within a couple decades following the beetle outbreak. If we thin or we burn those, we can sort of prolong that, so it takes up to 100 years before we're starting to be concerned about canopy bulk density in our pine stands, and the same with our spruce stands. And then where we've got aspen, we've got higher foliar moisture content and lower canopy bulk density, those areas are sort of going to stay below that critical threshold throughout. Conversely, if we look at crown base height, which is ladder fuels and the concern of fires reaching up and getting into a crown and becoming a running crown fire, we see that, initially when those stands are coming back after the bark beetle, our crown base height is very high. We don't have a concern. There's nothing there basically. And then in our untreated stands, they'll self-prune and start to get to a level that's of concern in about 50 years for our pine and our mixed stands. And that the burning can only have an effect on the crown base height for about a year. It doesn't really do all that much, and it never elevates the crown base height. So I wanted to finish up with a couple quick points just to show you some of the sort of other areas of research that we're pursuing, and other topics that have been sort of generated by our managers. We've got studies looking at how to handle our slash and what's going on with residual. And we heard a lot about the biomass management, and that's kind of a big piece of this as well. Since the beetle outbreak came in, there's been a predominant concern about fire and fuels management, but a lot of our hydrologists and other managers are saying, hey, we used to worry about other things. It's not just a fuels question here. So we used to leave more slash on the ground because we wanted to increase water yields coming out of these sites or retain nutrients. From a silvicultural perspective, we used to do more scarification. We've got operational and plot scale studies looking at these various treatments. One of the other topic areas that's a big concern and generated by our hydrologists has been, what's the value of maintaining riparian buffers when all the trees are dead? In some areas, they're leaving trees, and there's concern that maybe they'll become a fire magnet, that maybe there'll be fires in these riparian areas where the rest of the areas have been treated. The only place where a fire could burn is within this sort of sensitive habitat. And so there have been fuels treatments that have been conducted within riparian areas. But this is an area nobody really knows that much about. It flies in the face of all of our long-term best management practices about protecting riparian buffers. Similarly, a lot of the roadside hazard work is right along the roads that are right along the creeks, and safety's trumping the riparian buffer stuff. And so there's sort of a need to rethink our BMPs in these areas, and this is an area of active interest. The pile burning and slash disposal part fits in with what is being taken out, what's going on with our utilization, and why in the hell are we burning all of this material? And the public is kind of in looking at this and saying, I can think of 10 reasons why you shouldn't do this, but you're doing it anyway. All of the folks in this room probably have a good handle on how timber markets and utilization and the panic of getting work done might create situations like this. But we've got hundreds of thousands of these over the bark beetle forests in Colorado, and the Forest Service is in the process of kind of clicking them off of the stockpile. We know in these areas they create long-term effects in soils and vegetation. This is a photo of a clear cut from the 1970s, looking at the residuals of these pile burned areas within units. So we know that these can have a long-term effect on sort of forest cover. Currently, where there's a lot of work done in roadside hazard, then we're putting all of these huge piles right next to the creeks. So that's another piece of the puzzle where we know we have water quality concerns following burning. If you have them up high in the landscape, it may not be an issue, but if they're right down here next to the streams, maybe that is an issue. So we're looking at biomass questions. This is a new project. It just got started this last fall. And there's a lot of questions about, can we actually find some use to this? And there's many different components about the long-term feedstock supply. How do we process this stuff? A lot of the things that Tim was talking about yesterday are really, really key. How do you move small material around and actually make it pay? And then what's going on with the environmental effects? Is this mining nutrients out of sites? What's the regeneration going to be like? So that's just sort of a smattering of the things that we're working on. I guess in summary, our findings is that we're seeing a good amount of regeneration in a lot of our stands. We're not seeing a lot of areas that will require either post-beetle or post-harvest replanting work. We see that the treatments that go on the ground now may have a long-term influence on the trajectory of these stands, and that might have important impacts on things like water yield. I talked about fire. It also will affect the other important values like lynx habitat, things that are now kind of management concerns and people are just sort of grappling with at this time.